Welcome, welcome. Plenty of room. Come on in. $323 still going up. Give it another couple seconds here. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Looks like we have a really good turnout, 348 people, and it looks like it may be still going up, 349. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Native by Design, digging into 2021 with your garden plan. My name is Nate Keener, and I'm the Director of Sustainability at Lewis and Clark Community College. And I'll just kick things off here with a real quick introduction and some housekeeping here. You should see on your screen our gracious sponsors. We want to thank all of them for helping us out, not only this year, but in years past as well. And of course, want to thank all of our wonderful panelists, but also the committee members of the Southwest Illinois Event Planning Committee for helping to put this series on. Want to thank Brooke Widmer for being our host tonight. Charlie Pitts, Christine Favilla, Sarah Vogt, Scott Moss, Steve Brendel, Trevor Bennett, and Virginia Wolf Biley, all on the call tonight for their efforts in helping to put this event on this year and years past. This workshop series is temporarily taking the place of our annual spring workshop. We're as anxious as everybody to get back to in-person, so stay tuned for further updates on that front. Looks like might be some light at the end of this tunnel. Get back to our Friday half-day session, and we're looking forward to that. I'm sure you are too. So won't waste too much more time here. Just want to go over a couple of real quick things. So we're going to have, as soon as I'm done here, I'm going to kick it over to Scott Moss, who's going to be our moderator tonight. And he'll have a few slides introducing, giving a little more detail about our speakers and kind of introducing the topics for tonight. And we know you have lots of questions. And so we would ask that you use the Q&A feature at the top of your screen. It should be right there at the top next to the Zoom icon. And you should place your questions in there for the panelists. If you want to chat amongst yourself, want to share stories, things like that, you can use the chat function, which will be at the bottom of your screen in the More section there. We're going to have folks monitoring both, but like I said, if you could put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A feature, that'll just help us keep everything organized. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Scott Moss. He is the coordinator of restoration ecology at Lewis and Clark Community College, and he's going to be our moderator for tonight. So Scott, I'll kick it over to you.
All right, thanks, Nate. Real quickly, sort of lay out again the basics for how I'm going to run this through. We've got three great panelists, a lot of extensive experience here to discuss these topics. And so as the moderator, I sort of put together a pretty quick outline of some of the key topics that seem to come up with me frequently when we have these discussions. And so, of course, Jen, I want to personally thank the people who sponsor these events. Native plant gardening and the use of native plants has become much more popular. And again, when I started messing around with this stuff 15, 20 years ago, it was hard to find this stuff. And so you really were sort of making it up as you went. And now this has never been more available than ever. And certainly the Grow Native members and the Grow Native sponsors are sort of driving, making that happen. And so our quick agenda, we're going to try to spend about 8 minutes on each topic, and that usually keeps us within that 1 hour window. And so just from a rudimentary standpoint, we've got a quick discussion about site selection. And I realize we talked about site selection in our last webinar back in November, but this is specific to the planning stages about observing and knowing conditions. And so we've got a good set of discussion points about that, how to sketch out a plan and how to think ahead of this thing and plan your site and your garden for the year and for the years that follow. And then, of course, what to do next about getting your site ready and how long it takes sometimes to truly prep this thing for success. And then I know this is going to be a big source for our big part right here. We're going to talk about sourcing and resourcing and propagating your own plants, because, again, with native plants, there's a lot of variation how we approach this. Some people are purists and they want to get the most local stuff that they can get, and other people are a little more utilitarian about it, and they will purchase from all over the Midwest. And so just a discussion about those options. And then finally, the basics of installation, early phase maintenance. How that thing gets installed and how it starts is always going to dictate sort of the next, how fast and how rapid you achieve success with your garden. And so just a quick introduction to our panelists. Sarah Vogt, who is the conservation manager at Heartlands Conservancy. Again, seems like Sarah and I are always sort of orbiting the same kind of things. We pass each other, seeming like once a quarter or so at some event like this. We see each other more online, I think, or through emails and everything else than actual in-person meetings. But Sarah brings to the table a tremendous amount of experience just from the work that she's done with Heartlands. And again, we're glad to have her. Charlie Pitts is, again, Charlie and I have been kind of connecting on these native planting things. It's probably longer than we want to admit, right, Charlie? And so again, when people kind of approach me as an expert, I always think, well, a guy I learned a lot from is Charlie Pitts. So certainly, Charlie's resume kind of precedes him, and some of the things that he's involved in sort of have set the pace for a lot of what's going on with this type of work. And then this slide is kind of cool for me because both of these panelists are students of mine. So kind of a neat thing when you start realizing that your students are becoming experts in the things that they came and trained with you on. And certainly I'll just admit that both of these individuals probably know more about this stuff than I do, because I'm kind of hanging out in the safe zone of a college and they're out actually doing this stuff for a living. And the School of Hard Knocks teaches people pretty well. Christine Favilla, which was with the Sierra Club, and I think is now you working your master's at SIU still, or I didn't mean to put you on the spot. So we yes.
A little bit of a break until we get past remote learning for my daughter.
It does, yeah. So I know that she's taken this thing and taking it to the next level. I'm pretty excited about that. Works with the community gardens and La Vista, and just it seems to always, it's like I'll go to a new meeting about something, and I'll get invited to be involved in something, and I'll see the list, and Christine is always seems to be involved in these things, and she's just kind of really deeply involved in the community and ties to a lot of things that pertain to sustainability and nature. And then finally, Trevor Bennett, who again is a past student of mine, who is now working at Pure Air Natives with DJM, sponsors for Grow Native, and he also is, he's a project ecologist, and he's an inventory manager. And to be truly honest, when at this point, when I have questions about seed propagation and very specific things about native seeds, the guy that's on my speed dial is Trevor. And so again, that's kind of a really amazing thing when you see how this is starting to develop. So great experience and background that's on our panel tonight. And then finally, just a quick introduction of myself. I'm the coordinator of restoration ecology at Lewis and Clark Community College. I'm an expert in nothing and a dabbler in everything. And so I seem to just always, this has always been a passion of mine. And I got into working with native plants when I had a landscape business over 20 years ago, had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that as an ecologist, I was interested in this stuff and have just sort of taken this thing along for the ride as it's developed. It's been pretty amazing to see it happen. And so I started off the last webinar with this reality check. Number one, nobody on this call, none of us as experts are sitting here saying you have to go all native. In fact, it's probably not even a realistic expectation in most suburban settings. The idea is that we blend natives back into the landscape and make a more functional landscape. And of course, how do we do that? How do we create this natural cultivated landscape to achieve better results? Well, we focus on the big items. We want to focus on functionality. We also can do this with a keen eye to aesthetics and what it looks like. And of course, if you're truly interested in this, you've got to be always thinking about habitat and what it's doing, what it's providing back to the area around it. And of course, the ecological services that it provides. So these are sort of the buzzwords of our topic. When we think about native plantings, we want to make sure that we're keeping this always sort of the forefront of what we're doing. But I don't want to make this seem like it's unmanageable. It's just landscaping, right? And working with natives is no different than any other landscape effort. Again, all of us on this panel, we kind of were talking about it ahead of this, and we all agree. It's just all you got to do is change the language slightly. It's like working with a slightly different accent. It probably took you, if you're on this topic call, if you're on this webinar right now, you're probably somebody who's been playing around with gardening or doing this kind of work for years or even decades. And all that is really required here is that you're going to have to reset that knowledge. You got to kind of realize it took you a long time to accumulate that garden go-to list that you had. And you're going to have to do a little bit of work to reset that knowledge in order to make this shift. So you're kind of starting over with selection and knowledge, but I think that's part of the fun. It gets you back into new territory, allows you to investigate new things and redevelop those things that probably brought you to gardening in the first place. And so the rules haven't changed. You're putting plants in the soil. And you still got to put the right plants in the right soil and the right conditions to succeed. But what we'll all tell you, and what the rest of this panel is going to tell you in the next 35, 40, 45 minutes, is that it's absolutely worth it. And it's absolutely doable. And so we'll start off the panel discussion this evening with the topic of site selection. And so those site selection, it's about climate and microclimate. It's about, again, the right plants in the right place. And so, as we get together as a panel, we kind of discuss everybody's experience. And what I basically am going to do is turn it over to my panel at this point and, selected experts. And I know Christine was sort of the lead to start off discussing some of her experience with site selection. So Christine, if you want to go ahead and take it for a second.
Thank you, Scott. And welcome, everybody. It's pretty exciting to see there's so many people interested in planting with natives. 2021, I think, is going to be a fabulous year because of all the education and the incredible webinars that we've all been able to get on. At least I feel like I've been able to get on many more educational things during the COVID stay-at-home order. So if I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen and pull up a couple of slides here. So, oh gosh, and we'll just work with, you can see all of them. So the site selection, it really just depends on where you are. I mean, your front yard can be drastically different from your backyard, and your side yard might be a combination of both, which is mine. And so really, I mean, the first thing I always think of is what's the sun doing in that site? What's it doing in the spring? What's it doing in August? What's it all about in the fall? And so, of course, we're in winter now. I would definitely start paying attention to the sun map.
Christine, would you mind going full screen?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do that. I apologize. Nope. Anyone want to help me?
At the very bottom, there's kind of what you're hovering over. That one that looks like a presentation.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yep.
Excellent. So this is just an example of one of the plans that we had when we were working at Hellrung Park in Alton. It's an inner city park. We have 4 raised beds that are awkwardly shaped, as you can see. They kind of make a circle the way they're, the bottom is down all towards each other. So each one is facing a different direction, really, when you're in the center and you're looking at the garden. The first thing is literally just look at your cardinal directions. And if you were wanting to do more prairie plants, which is what we decided for this, and you know that the sun is moving across that direction, you want to make sure that your patch up here is not going to shade out things down here unless you have plants that are for partial shade. So when you're at your house, you also need to think about just the built landscape and what's going on with garages, trees that are going to be coming into full bloom. And then you want to, of course, look at your drainage, your water. I think they're going to have more detail about that in just a couple of minutes. But this is one I had at my house last year, and you're starting to look and thinking about it. You really should sketch it out to scale, and plan for those plants to be adult plants in about 3 years. So while it might look pretty sparse when you start, give it time, and you just want to definitely plan for that. And I don't want to take over, so I thought if someone else might want to have an opportunity. Well, if not, I do have some local plans that I've been able to find. The St. Louis Wild Ones is a very accessible website. The URL is down at the bottom, and it will go into all sorts of different regions about where you live, and it will literally have a site plan drawn up like this. You can zoom in, see what's going on. It really does help you think about you have impervious surface on your deck, or maybe a patio. So what's the water going to do there? Are you going to use a rain barrel and redistribute it? So I would just highly suggest that you search online for other native plant designs. They're out there prolifically right now.
Christine, we have one question in the Q&A.
Yes.
Asking, how important is the sun cycle for a small yard? Is it more important to size up the trees and their locations?
I mean, you got to, once again, that's a climate and microclimate. Underneath my oak tree up front, I know nothing's growing there, and it hasn't grown there. And even, shade grass mix didn't seem to do well. But during, the early spring and the fall, it does seem to get a lot more sun just because of, the leafing out of the trees. So I have a bunch of alliums, different types of wild onion bulbs underneath there. They're going to get the sun in the spring and the fall, and that's about all they need. So it's a combination of both, I would say.
I'd like to add to that too, if I can. I was talking to Scott the other day about ecological sites, and the Web Soil Survey, the USDA Web Soil Survey, actually has an interactive map where you can look at, to an extent, your ecological site, based on the soil series presence there. Now, a lot of these sites have been degraded, but for some of them, it does offer a reference plant community, and that reference plant community can be a good template to infer what's going to survive in a site. For instance, if you have a tree or native tree such as black walnut that has a tendency to have allelopathic tendencies and secrete that juglone into the soil profile, you might be able to select a series of, find some sedges that are used to that, or more tolerant than something that's a true prairie plant.
And just to add on, I'll add on to that real quickly if you guys don't mind. But again, it's that modification. Most of us are talking about landscaping at our homes. Obviously, those are going to be either suburban residential or urban residential type areas. And so I would advocate, and I do this in my class pretty frequently, is not to tie yourself necessarily to what was once there, because the reality is you're probably not going to be able to get it back. Your site, you can do all you want on your site, but your site is influenced by all the things going on around it. And so you really got to start thinking in terms of novel ecosystems and innovative type systems. And so again, kind of as Christine was pointing out, know your site, know exactly how the sun is handling it, and be aware of things like the oak trees and how tannins in the soil and leaves affect things. But I would say, try to be creative with those things and use what will actually grow. And in the oak type setting, again, the wild onions and the wild garlic and other things, but there's a lot of woodland type plants that are becoming more and more available. But I'm surprised at what I can get to grow underneath what we think of as shade in a suburban setting. And prairie plants like little blue stem will, if they go, then they work, and you just go with them and just work within that context. So there's a lot of experimentation that goes along with this. There's no single how-to book. And so I think that's what I find exciting about it, is you get to sort of work it out as you go along.
Yeah,
So-
you shouldn't be afraid to try a plant somewhere, in my opinion, if you like it, because sometimes they surprise you. A plant that's supposed to be in full sun, according to the catalog or the table, can thrive in your northern shady area of your house. Or sometimes they just surprise you. And if a plant isn't thriving, you can dig them up and move them.
Beauty of working with perennials, right?
Yeah.
So, and to kind of tie this one up again, anybody who's had class with me or has heard me speak before, I'm always sort of beating the drum of goals and outcomes. Not because I want you to tie yourself to some preconceived notion of what it's going to be when you start, but ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve? And if you're trying to achieve, more pollinator access or more pollinator support, then you're going to constantly be moving that direction. And just because it says this plant won't grow there, shouldn't grow there, doesn't mean it won't grow there, as Sarah points out. And so just, work in direction of your goals and outcomes. And I'm not, the restoration ecology just in me is screaming when I say this, but the landscaper knows I'm right. And that is, you got to grow what's going to grow there for your ultimate goals and outcomes. The landscape, right? It's not a natural landscape. It's a landscape, and it's got a purpose.
And to add to that too, I know this is more about sourcing than site selection, but really they're one and the same. You can't have one without the other. Most people that are relatively familiar with ecological restoration and native plants are familiar with conservation coefficients. Most people tend to think that that's a numerical value that represents, how beneficial that species might be, but really it's a numerical value that represents where a plant might occur, like the niche it might occur in. So the higher the value, the more rare that habitat. So if you have a site that is pretty intolerant or not conducive to growing a lot of things, I would go through and select plants that have a lower conservation coefficient, because generally they're going to be more aggressive.
All right, I like it. Any final words on site selection for the group?
We got a couple of questions in the Q&A. A few of them look like they may be for some topics coming up, but if a couple of our panelists wouldn't mind jumping into the Q&A there and answering a couple of those, that'd be great.
Okay. I'll move us along, and then I'll take a look when I turn it over to somebody there, Nate. So obviously, the idea of site selection is going to lead directly to the development of a plan. And, again, we all have residential yards. There's spaces that are going to work, and there's spaces that are going to not work for these types of applications. And so sometimes the site is going to select you. You want to put in natives, you want to move this way, but you only have this spot to work with. It doesn't matter. Once you get to that point, that site being the site, then the next thing is to start planning for how that's going to look and how that's going to work. And again, I'm going to turn this over to Christine and Sarah, because they are primaries on this and they've done a lot of this. But I'll just tell you, I cheat. Kind of a common saying, if you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough. And I'm looking at what everybody else is doing. I'm always sort of inspiring myself with what other people are successfully doing and growing. and then making it my own. And so that's that first concept of what you want to do, this idea in your head, is where you start with the planning starts. So again, look at everybody else, sketch a plan, and then go out and start flagging it and laying it out. And with that kind of introduction, again, I'm going to turn this back to Christine, and I probably should bring up that excellent slide that she had earlier, walk through that process of how she planned it. Christine, I think you're muted.
It's going to be like the most popular phrase out there. I apologize. So yeah, what are your goals? You had mentioned, are you wanting to go back 100% natural, whatever that, pre-settlement time is? Or are you really wanting to garden for birds? And if you're gardening for birds, you need to know that you're gardening for insects, including caterpillars, because that's what the birds eat. So you're also gardening for butterflies. So I just put up kind of my 3 or 4 tips for all of them. I won't read them out loud, but layering your foliage is going to help for all of those critters. It's also going to be really aesthetically pleasing. And you'll have variety of things blooming and of interest throughout the season. And so talking about having those canopy trees and then some shade tolerant trees, as well as some shrubs, and we can go into detail on what those are when we're talking about procuring them. But definitely try and keep your mowed turf area as small as you can, if that's what you're growing for. Because they're going to need to have existing vegetation to kind of hide out in, and while they're waiting to eat, or as they're coming into your yard and seeing if it's safe. So that's more of the backyard bird. The pollinators, and because I work for Sierra Club, we're part of the Illinois Monarch campaign, which is a wonderful program, and I've really tried to kind of dig into some of the research on milkweed and pollinators. So definitely having a mix. If you want it to end up being certified, you're going to need to have 10 milkweed plants made up of at least 2 species, as well as a selection of nectar plants. So this is just kind of that planning phase. What are you wanting to do? Are you trying to bring in, specifically the monarchs? Well, then, you're going to want to put that milkweed on the outside. If you put it on the inside of a very varied wildflower patch, there's chemicals and other things that they're smelling as they're coming in that will be covered up. At least that's what I've seen with some of the researches. It's good to have them mixed in with other plants, but to keep them on the outside of the perimeter. I don't know if we want me to go in any further than those. I think really just going and checking out some of those are great websites. The Department of Natural Resources in Illinois and USDA has some wonderful guides. I don't know if this will be linked for you, so I'll go ahead and throw it in the chat. We'll talk about that one later. Was that what you were wanting, Scott?
That works. Sarah or anybody else, do you have anything that you want to add to that kind of planning discussion guide, planning guide discussion?
I'll add a couple of comments. In addition to the milkweed, Christine talked about having other flowering plants. Also consider looking at what times of the season that they flower, so that you get a mix, a good mix, so there's always something flowering. Pick something that flowers early, as well as maybe some asters that flower all the way to September. So you always have that food source. And yeah, we talk about native plants so much, and we often immediately think of potted plants, coneflowers, and black-eyed Susans and all that great stuff, but we forget about trees and shrubs sometimes, which are equally as important. So we need to get those layers in there, important parts that sometimes get forgotten. And there's a lot of great native shrubs around. So
I'd like to add to that. That's really important that you do have a good component of trees and shrubs, because oftentimes they're the first flowering species available to important pollinators. For instance, serviceberry, it blooms extremely early. And, they bloom late into the year too. So often at times when nothing else is blooming, such as witch hazel.
Yeah,
And
I'm sorry. When I teach this topic, I teach a lot about structure, creating structure. If you're truly trying to go for habitat that's going to support wildlife, birds, bees, butterflies, then you need a diversity of not just plants, but structure within that system to make that system usable. And so this is something we spend a lot of time on in our classes talking about is building out structure. And you can actually do that on a very small scale, very small places that you can build structure with trees, shrubs, and a number of different flowering plants and grasses. So absolutely great point.
looks like we got 3 different questions here on the, I think, all related to the conservation value ecological coefficient. Do we have more resources on where folks can get information about that?
I'm sorry, I was typing the answer. What was that?
It looks like there's 3 different questions, and I think they're all the same, asking about how do you discover how do you find the conservation value and then the ecological coefficient? So
it actually is really a state by state basis. However, if you get onto the field office technical guide, you type that into the Google machine, it will bring up the NRCS and USDA reference information. And I believe it's under section 4. If you look for materials and type in calculator for your state, it will bring up the seed calculators. Sometimes the tab is hidden, but if you look at the species, it brings out a whole lot of information on them, everything from seeds per pound to the amount of the recommended amount to seed for a pure stand, and the conservation value. There's also information in some educational resources. Justin Thomas, I believe, is somebody who did a lot of research in Missouri and established some conservation values for species here while there. I'm in Illinois right now.
From the point of view of a lot of gardeners or small nativists, that may not be a terribly important point because it may, what the very best plant from that point of view may be totally overridden by what will actually grow in your yard. So maybe a counterbalance to that is check out what is growing around you, because that's successful because it fits a particular niche. It fits the pollinators, it fits the herbivores, it fits the birds that keep those in check. So in the local area, those statewide figures are kind of interesting from a scientific point of view, but from the local area, what's in your yard, it may not have a lot of direct use.
And also never forget, the primary driver of all this is what things can you get your hands on. The textbooks, you can pull up, Vegetation of Missouri and look at all those different cultural guides, and you come up with a number of great things that should be in your yard. Chances are you're not going to be able to get your hands on but a fraction of them. So that's always going to be the driver. What plants can you actually grow? And the more rare and unusual it is, the less likely you're going to be able to get it commercially, and the more likely you're going to come up with a source for yourself. So final things on that, I kind of already moved the slide forward. Everybody, I assume, can see the next slide. Is that correct?
You're not screen sharing anymore.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to fix that.
While Scott's doing that, what really happens when you go to a plant sale for native plants is you have your list of the 6 things you want to buy. And sure enough, there's absolutely one of them there. So the question is, okay, not what I want to buy. So I would advise people who want a specific plant to have some alternatives so that they know, well, I can't get that, but this will work in that area. Because it's pretty hard to get exactly what you want.
Absolutely agreed. And that's where you have to become creative and again, within the confines of the law and everything's allowed, pick your own seeds and learn to germinate them yourself. But that's a topic that's going to come up here shortly. So moving on to getting the site ready, there's a million kind of practical ways to approach this topic. And again, I'm just going to turn this thing back over to Trevor and Charlie primarily, but Christine, again, has a lot of experience with this. And so I'll kind of let them get going in this. Just competing vegetation is always going to be a problem. Do we amend? Do we not amend? And then, of course, always be considerate of what water's doing in your yard because it's going to dictate everything. And maybe we'll do it this way. Charlie, I've kind of not brought you to the forefront, so I'm going to let you lead this one off if you're okay with that. Charlie. There we go.
I can fall into that trap. So competing vegetation, from a gardener's point of view, and that's really my primary focus. What competing vegetation do I have? What is gonna, and by competing vegetation, the question is, what is gonna outgrow the thing I wanna grow? It's fairly simple for things like vegetables where you go, well, I want to grow tomatoes. And what will outgrow my tomatoes? And the answer is very little after they get started. So is there competing vegetation for tomatoes? And the answer is, well, not really. And in fact, some vegetation in your tomato patch may well help the tomatoes grow because it retains moisture and adds nutrients. The same thing is true with anything native plant. You want to make sure that competing vegetation, and usually we kind of talk with the pejorative of invasives, meaning that the plants are not native and they grow faster and better than our native because they don't have any drawbacks like little bugs eating on them or a big deer eating on them. So one of the things you want to do is identify where you're planting your plants. What are the competitors around there? Competing vegetation, for example, if you want to plant a sunflower, don't plant it on the north side of a shrub. So that in a lot of ways is a competing vegetation. If you want to plant a series of plants next to a small pond or wet area in your yard, if you plant ones that like dry vegetation, they're not going to do well. So you want to kind of evaluate what else is there and what you need to get rid of or suppress so that it has a chance. And of course, turf grass, a lot of grasses, Bermuda grass especially, are competing vegetations that will simply outcompete almost anything that you plant. Who is going to tag team me on this? Somebody, I know I'm forgetting a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So typically when you talk about readying your site and talk about competing vegetation, it is easy if you're somebody that deals with this frequently to assume that most everyone understands what we're talking about. A lot of the things, if we're talking about a landscape, a lot of what you're going to be dealing with is cool season grasses. And part of that comes into understanding, it's like, well, okay, well, fescue, it's just fescue. However, you have to understand that native plants, often perennials and many other, variations on native plants have like they have dormancy that they need to have broken. And many small seeded natives need light to germinate. Cool season grasses and cool season bunch grasses in particular have a tendency to form a thatch layer. And as that thatch forms, and it creates a barrier, and that can inhibit the germination of seed in the seed bank. It can also, you know, if you have a quick establishing plant like a fast growing introduced annual, it can canopy over a new seedling that might take, you know, be investing all its time in developing a root system, but it still needs those resources. And you know, if a plant is canopying over them, they can steal those resources and atrophy the plant to the point where it can't come back.
Trevor.
Yeah.
It looks like I got 3 requests in the Q&A there for those conservation value, ecological coefficient references. If you wouldn't mind typing those sites in there again.
And I'll try to jump in on this one as well, because that last bullet point, water has priority. And again, anybody who's had class with me, and we're always sort of mixing the concepts of stormwater and irrigation and growing of native plants. And of course, water is going to dictate. We call it, again, we refer to it constantly as the primacy of water. Water's got the right of way on the site. It's going to determine everything that happens. And it's really misunderstood aspect of suburban landscapes because it's sort of a feast or famine thing. You don't really realize unless you stand out in your yard in the rain and watch how water comes off of your roof, down your downspouts, and what it does next, at the way it's going to accumulate for periods of time in your yard. And so in readying your site and getting your site ready, one of the very biggest, most helpful tips that I can give you is deal with that water, realize what it's doing, and then kind of make a determination as to what you can do to kind of direct it or make it better. And that's going to make you more successful. So if you want to grow plants that need more water, then direct that water to the site. If you want to grow more xeric or dry conditioned plants, then again, get that water away from them. So I'm noticing here that Christine has popped up some slides.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm gonna let you run with it.
So I had just, you know, like a 6-foot space in between my driveway and my neighbor's driveway. The picture on the left, it's kind of confusing. The picture on the left is looking from the street towards my, you know, garage and backyard. The other one is turned around. It's facing the other direction. I just need to get better about planning those before and after shots. But in the left-hand side, you can almost see how it goes down. It's low. There's a puddle there every time it rains. And so that is where I have, you know, a couple different kinds of sedges and some blue flag iris and some, I need to get some swamp milkweed in there. I think it would do great. But then as you go up further, I mean, that's where I have a lot of my drier prairie plants, the monarda and such, that's kind of up there and in that direction. So yeah, I stood out in the rain. That's just what I did to try and watch it when I first moved in. This one's a little bit about the site prep. It's once again, you know, you've planned it, you've gotten some of your plugs. I didn't do any seeds in this back one. You've gotten some shrubs and whatnot in that second one. And then I actually went out and rented a sod cutter. The previous slide that was along the driveway, I literally just did a solarizing on it, or I dug up, you know, I got really good at cutting turf out, turning it upside down and just laying it right there. So it, you know, kind of composted as it was laying there. But the sod cutter was wonderful. I did a huge other section of my yard. And once again, it looks pretty sparse. The middle one's like, oh, wow, that doesn't look like much. But, you know, this is the second year growth. Because of just their nature, elderberry is kind of really going crazy. I need to trim it this year. But I mean, that's that exact same section just 1 year after I planted it. So you have to really pay attention to spacing it out. And I like to use hula hoops because I have all sorts of different sizes, and it's just an easy, nice reference for my brain as I'm laying it down. And that's all.
All right, thank you. So let me get back to sharing my screen here. And so anyone have any last pieces for readying your site? Again, I think most gardeners, this is a concept that they're familiar with. This is not the first rodeo. They know how to get a place ready for plants.
Scott, we've had a lot of questions about dealing with clay soil. Is
Oof, okay.
that okay, or are people are wanting to know if they need to add things to their soil to get these plants to grow?
So most people in this, I'll kind of jump in here. I've been trying to bounce back and forth and read questions. As far as site preparation goes, cover crop is a really important thing to use too. I know it doesn't get used as much on smaller landscape settings, but if you are in a highly graded area, an area that's been highly disturbed, basically the A and B horizons are gone. It's a good idea to utilize some quick establishing cover crop that will help condition your soil for you. So for instance, I had mentioned this to somebody in the Q&A earlier. Turnips are a great option to help condition your soil and aerate it a little bit. They'll germinate pretty quickly. Oats, regular seed oats, which you can get for fairly cheap, they will help suppress any of the weed seeds that are coming up, but they also have a good establishment with the native biome, so they help bring that the beneficial bacteria back into that area. Not to mention, if you cut it and leave it on site, and as it decomposes, it'll give a good source of carbon. If you're seeding a small area, you can utilize parboiled rice hulls, which are just the hulls off of rice grain. They've been superheated to eliminate the weed seed, and they will work their way into the soil, help keep the soil from compressing and compacting, and break down to form a good source of carbon for developing seeds. Not only that, but if you're mixing up small seeds into larger seeds, they act as a good placeholder and keep the small seeds suspended in your mix. So.
Absolutely, great point. I use annual rye. It is super cheap. It grows pretty quickly, and you just mow it off. And again, this topic probably should come up as we kind of move into the thing. When we start discussing mulches, I'm always in big favor of using green mulches, which is the growth of cover crops. So this is probably the topic everybody wants to know the most about. So I don't want to get bogged down here too long. We'll probably come back in later episodes of these webinars and continue to talk about these things. Sourcing and propagating plants is the key thing. And so when we talk about sourcing plants, you've got to immediately make the decision between, do I do this with seed? Do I buy bare roots where those things are even available? Do I go with plugs or do I buy potted plants? And this is a choice you have to make. It comes down to a couple of simple things. Seed, you're working from scratch and you're going to wait a long time to get results but you're going to spend less. All the way to the other end of that spectrum, which is using potted plants, which you'll get immediate results, but you're going to spend more. So there's a kind of an economy of scale that has to be considered, and a lot of other things have to come in here. Certainly, if you're interested in very specific natives, almost always the tip you're going to hear is to kind of learn to grow your own. It's certainly not something that all of our grow native partners want to hear, and it's not even practical. You're going to go to the experts and buy your plants from them because they know how to get these things done. But there is always the alternative, in these settings to try to propagate and grow your own. And so there's a lot of work being done in plant propagation with natives. You're starting to see more and more and more in the literature about that. But just understand that when you start propagating and growing your own, that becomes a lengthy process. Just the learning parts of it are sometimes time prohibitive. And then again, plant propagation here kind of with natives, while it's the same, it does, I can tell you from experience, they just don't behave always the same way that you would with just propagating and dividing up common horticulturally available plants. And so, again, this is one of those places where this is what Trevor does. So I'm going to throw this over to him, but him and Charlie have sort of, and Sarah have all stepped up to kind of talk about this section. And so I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let them do their thing.
All right. I don't have much to share on my screen. It's kind of all technical jargon, but yeah, as far as propagating goes, you have to understand that it's not as easy as just putting it in the soil and hoping for the best. However, this time of year is the best time to plant because these plants will break their natural dormancy by being exposed to repeated freeze-thaw cycles. So dormant season seeding is always recommended for this time. But if you're propagating to grow into a plug and transplant into your garden, familiarize yourself with the different stratification periods. So you'll see C30 or C60, and that typically refers to either cold dry stratification or cold moist stratification for 30 days or 60 days. Legumes, anything in the family Fabaceae, as a general rule of thumb, will need to be scarified. And it's also recommended that you inoculate them with a genus-specific rhizobium, which is just kind of an inert bacteria that will help colonize the roots once they've actually germinated. Also, as I mentioned earlier, many natives, many people are tempted when they seed into their pots to try and put it into the soil thinking that will help, but many small seeded natives such as Culver's root, blue lobelia, they need light to germinate, and if you put them too deep in the soil profile, they'll sit there dormant or just decompose. I do recommend that if you're starting out and you've never seeded natives before, to start with a community flat, which is basically just a flat tray full of soil where you can seed into it, and then whatever comes up, but you can transplant them. And once you've transplanted them, that gives you a good starting point and an idea for what stratification is going to be necessary. A lot of the most popular landscape grasses are bunch grasses as well. And don't think that you need to have seed to propagate. Most people are overwhelmed if they're just starting into this by vegetative propagation. But things like prairie drop seed are extremely easy to propagate vegetatively. You can dig them up, you can abuse a fully grown prairie drop seed, you can split it into 100 different plants, and they generally do pretty well that way. But it's a different story growing them from seed. You're lucky if 10% of your plants make it to maturity from that point. I would say keep detailed notes about the plants as you're propagating them, and a good resource is the Native Plant Propagation Network, which I believe is sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service. But it has, if you're really getting into it, there's a lot of written protocols for propagation on there for a whole range of native species. And they really can, for lack of a better turn of phrase, get into the weeds on some of this stuff. But it's a invaluable resource. And not to promote another seed company, but Prairie Moon also has a quick reference down below on each one of their plant species that mentions the stratification period required. And it might say, this seed needs scarification if it's a legume, but it also needs hot water treatment to scarify, or it needs to be followed with cold moist stratification for 10 days. I do recommend trying not to grow into too large of a container as well. It's always better to start small and then transplant up as needed, rather than to try and seed directly into a quart because that's what you'd like to plant. So that's pretty much all.
You don't mind I jump in there just real quickly?
No, not at all.
Probably one of the biggest tips that I can give you, and we're doing this right now at school, is just we purchase the things that we're interested in growing. We do it for plant sale, but obviously we do it for planting out on the campus as well. And it's cold stratification. The simplest, easiest way I found to do it is use the small leftover metal trays from cooking. We take the aluminum trays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, things like that as we cook. I just, wipe those out really quickly. I throw them into a pile in the garage. I take them up to the greenhouse. We put about an inch or two of brand new, fresh potting soil that's sterilized into them, put our seeds in there, and then we wet them down and we stick them out in the high tunnels outside and let them stay cold for a few months. And then when we're ready, we bring them in. We'll be bringing them in March-ish time frame, and we'll bring them into the greenhouse. Or, if you're doing this at home, you can stick them into a nice, warm, sunny spot and just keep them watered and let them germinate. And so the trick with cold stratification is just sort of, maintaining the cold conditions until you're ready for them. And again, that technique I actually, learned from, some of the people who I had assisted me from DJM and Pure Air Natives, and like, this is simple. We can do this, and it's been pretty successful. You take those small seedlings and transplant them to bigger pots, as Trevor suggested, and then when they're ready, you stick them in the ground. So again, there's a lot to think about, and this is a very lengthy process. Props on you for citing the competitor, because again, I know Prairie Moon Nurseries out of Minnesota is not sort of in vogue among a lot of the purists here locally, but their cultural guide is pretty much untouchable. So you don't have to buy plants from them. They're hideously expensive, and the shipping alone sort of precludes it. But if you want to learn about native plants, just go check their cultural guide out and just, steal the information from it, because it's extraordinary. Anybody else have anything to add? I know we could go on with this one forever.
Yeah, well, there's point of view. If you're starting out, please buy living plants. I do start a lot of plants from seeds, and it has taken me some time as a slow learner to learn what kind of seeds and how to manage them and when I need to start. It is certainly doable. It is a lot of fun, but for somebody that is just getting into native plants, I would urge you to consider buying small starts, very small pots, because they're not much more expensive than all the setup that you're going to need in order to do reliable seed starts. Plus, it'll get you up and running a little early and give you an idea to see what it's like in that growth stage, which will help you learn when you do start your seeds, how to take care of them.
Get a couple early wins under your belt, in other words, Charlie. It looks like we're bumping up against the end of the webinar here. I wonder if we might be able to hold the webinar open for a couple of more minutes, so our experts maybe jump in the Q&A there and answer some of those questions that are hanging out there, tag team, and get those knocked out, or at least some of them there. And yeah, we do plan to continue to host these webinars, as this is a part of a longer series, and we will. I'm seeing a lot of questions in there about the different kinds of plants and suggestions for different kinds of conditions. And if we aren't able to answer all this tonight, we will be hosting future webinars here in the next couple of months, trying to keep it in timing with, as what phase of your garden planning and planting and maintenance you're in at the time. So we're trying to time it so that that's what you're thinking about when we have the webinar. And so stay tuned for that. And Scott, do you have anything to close us out?
No, so yeah, I think your point is well taken, Nate. With this install thing, we'll have to consider bringing this over into the next episodes. again, more timely to March and April when we'll be actually doing this. Again, nothing more to add other than the fact that my experience with this thing, I absolutely endorse what Charlie just said. Start with things that you can work with. There are a number of these native plants available at all kinds of outlets, but I certainly encourage you to come out. Shameless plug. We're going, native plant sale at the Nature Institute in Godfrey, Illinois. That's going to have multiple vendors at it on May the 8th. But there are native plant sales going on at all sorts of farmers markets all over the area. Go support these people. They're doing great work.
Yeah, I would agree. I would recommend, like Charlie said, buying plants. Especially, I use seed for my large area restorations, but planting in my landscaping around the house, I use potted plants. And the one of the biggest questions I get is where to get them, and that your local plant sales are a great source. More nurseries are carrying potted plants, especially Grow Native has pushed those purple pots. So if you see a purple pot, it's probably a native. And there's the farmer markets, there's swaps. Yeah, and then online, like Prairie Moon and also Missouri Wildflower.
I do have some resources. So one of the things for anybody that is interested in trying some propagation, there's another resource. It's called the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Iowa State University, I believe, is who runs it. But they have a native plant propagation guide that's about 125 pages long. But they do list several really popular and iconic prairie species, what it takes to stratify them and overcome, the inherent dormancy and propagate them. So I don't know if there's a way I can share it on here, but it is a resource that's available publicly.
Yeah, I think, Trevor, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat where everybody can see it. And then we've gotten a few questions about the slides. So I will coordinate with our speakers to get those slide decks over to Brooke with Grow Native. And when she sends out the link to the recording of this event, I'll try to make sure those are included. And I believe that Brooke also mentioned that the chat logs and the Q&A logs can also be made available. So just want to thank all of our speakers again for all of their expertise and willingness to share this information with us. And it looks like we're up to 49 open questions still in the Q&A. So if our panelists maybe have another 5 to 10 minutes, they could just hang out with us here and whip through some of these questions. And then, like we said, please do stay tuned, because we do plan to host future webinars on some of these other topics. So thank you again for everybody. Thanks to Grow Native and our wonderful speakers, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Nate.
Maybe another 2 minutes, and then we'll close down the webinar here.
Just to address somebody's concern, I've had a couple questions about, sourcing organic seeds. Just so everyone's aware, a lot of places where you might obtain native seeds or native plants have to abide by state agricultural laws. So the Missouri seed law dictates that there are certain noxious weeds aren't allowed. And so we try to manage that as best as possible. So one thing I would say that regardless of where you're sourcing seed material or plant material from, be sure that it's a trusted source. Don't just go with the cheapest source, because there are companies that will sell you native seed that was grown and harvested in foreign countries. There are also, foreign seed companies that do move a lot of species we have endemic to the United States, like gelato seed, which I believe is out of Germany. I'm not sure, but so sourcing is important, because you definitely don't want to introduce a non-native species trying to do well.
Rapidly answer questions here. So
Well, I said 2 minutes, but it looks like there's still some typing going on there. So I'll just kind of monitor it and see if it slows down here in a second.
we're putting a dent in them.
I think I've answered all that I can.
Yeah.
I don't know enough.
All right. Well, yeah, maybe that's a good approach. Just once you've answered all you can, maybe just give me a heads up, and when we're out of people who can answer, then we'll just shut her off. Fewer than 10 questions. Can we get through them?
Hey, Charlie, are you familiar at all with that hydrangea pollination question?
I didn't see it.
Yeah, it's a beekeeper in Southwest Missouri is wanting to find hydrangea that bees can pollinate.
Yeah, any of the native hydrangeas work. I'll answer that one.
Okay, yeah. This one, I don't really, this is a comment and a question, I think. Section on remediating soil is good. Killer can turnips.
So,
I mean, Trevor, I think turnips can grow in pretty much anything, can't they? I mean, they're
yeah, I mean,
just stick them in there and let them go.
yeah, just, I mean, the thing with cover crops too is don't get too hung up on seeding rates. Just, you know, the reason it's a cover crop is it's not going to be there forever. So it's cheap enough
Right.
and that you can go heavy, you know? So like with turnips, radishes, anything like that. So I like purple top turnips and I like daikon radishes. They seem to work really well. They smell horrible this time of year if you leave them in the ground. But you know, tilling them into the ground does benefit it.
I was going to ask that. What do you do with those tubers? Do you pick them? Do you till them?
Till them.
Till them on in, huh? Okay.
Yep. That being said, always be aware of the site history as well. I've had a lot of people that have tried to plant sites and they instantly want to condition the soil and till. I don't advocate tilling unless it's absolutely necessary because especially when you fight species like Sericea lespedeza, if it's down there and you've killed it off and there's some in the soil bank and it's just low enough to not germinate, leave it there. Don't touch the soil.
Soil disruption is the avenue of last resort.
Right.
Hey, there's a question out here, Trevor, about penstemons cross-pollinating and creating hybrids. I mean, I know that there are a lot of hybrids that are sold. I'm not familiar with any natives that are cross-pollinating.
They're actually, you know, I'm not aware of penstemon. I think one of the there's Husker Red, which is a really popular horticultural variety of Penstemon digitalis. But typically it's not, I haven't had an issue with them cross-pollinating. There's actually 2 native species that will cross-pollinate and it becomes an issue because they typically don't exist in the same, they don't typically find them in close proximity, but to be aware of is Asclepias sullivantii and Asclepias syriaca. So common milkweed and prairie milkweed can cross-pollinate and create unviable offspring. So that is something to be aware of. I know that that's not something that's hugely problematic for a lot of people, but it's one of those things that does happen.
Awesome. I think I just got a question. So
Yeah.
I don't know how many people are still hanging out there.
We still have 59. So thanks everybody for tuning in and thanks for our panelists for hanging in there and getting through all those questions. I didn't think we'd get through all of them, but it looks like we answered 85 questions there. So, and like I said,
right answers we gave.
Yeah, luckily it's not a test. So these should be available with the recording. So thank you again and have a good night.
Well done, folks.
Yes,
All right.
thank you all.
See you all at the next meeting.
All right.